Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Hello, people who are joining me live. Hello, people who are joining later on during the week, as I know a lot of people tend to do with this series. My name is Tyran Parke, for the people that I haven't met. I know a lot of you, we've been tuning in each week, and it's been so fantastic. I'm so excited, really, about what this series has meant to the Australian Musical Theatre Festival. Excuse me. I really wanted to put this together so that we could start some conversations about musical theatre in the lead up to announcing the program for the Australian Musical Theatre Festival for next year. And in that, I wanted to interview a range of people about musical theatre and about what it was like to work inside of musical theatre. And shortly, I will be interviewing a really wonderful, dear friend of mine, who I know many of you know from his extraordinary work. But before I do that, I just wanted to take that moment, particularly, I can feel my own heart rate get excited when I'm about to say his name, and I still can't quite believe that he is a friend of mine. But there's a thing that I always have realised is important, not just as an acknowledgement for other people, but for myself, to just ground myself, which is to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I am currently on, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional and ongoing custodians of La Truita. The traditional owners of the land have sung their song and danced their dances and told their stories for many thousands of years before us. And so it's always a moment for me. I know now it's quite rightly becoming part of every ceremony that there is an acknowledgement that we are on land and sovereignty was never ceded. When we talk about culture, I feel that is even more important to remind myself that I am on land that has had a culture, one of the oldest cultures in the world, and I'm very privileged to continue discussing culture, music, stories, dance, on this land. And I wanted to just respectfully acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging. And now I want to introduce our final guest to the Sunday Soiree series. And the reason that we are at 10 a.m. in the morning, if you're watching live, is because we've gone international for the first time this week. When I put together a list of people that I would love to have a conversation with, I sort of said to the advisory group at the Australian Musical Theatre Festival, and then wouldn't it be great to finish with, someone extraordinary like Stephen Schwartz? And there was a little bit of like, well, sure, but how's that ever going to happen? And I know, growing up in Newcastle and being in love with the soundtracks to Pippin and Godspell and The Baker's Wife and Children of Eden and so many things that I loved as I was growing up, it felt Broadway feels a long way away. And to actually meet somebody like my next guest and be reminded that we are all artists in pursuit of the same thing, which is to tell stories, has been really humbling for me. I am delighted that he has agreed to join us today and have a conversation about his work and about what this year might have meant to him. He is, as I said, somebody I've been very fortunate to know for many years, or not many years actually, but about 10 years, and is a dear friend. And I really can't believe I'm about to welcome the remarkable Stephen Schwartz, all the way from Connecticut.
All the way from Connecticut. I know you're not having a soiree right now live down there, but it's a soiree for me, as you can see in the background. It's evening here at 6 o'clock in the evening, and of course it's our winter, or almost our winter, so it gets dark very early. So yeah. This is definitely soiree time for me.
I would never usually hold a soiree at 10 a.m. in the morning, and usually this is about the time of year where you kind of try to get to Melbourne to see the tennis
I
So
know. I missed the tennis, and it turns out that one of the first productions of live theater again in the world is the production of Pippin, which just opened in Sydney. And it's a production that I love because it's the 2013 Broadway revival, which was brilliantly directed by Diane Paulus. And I was so looking forward to being there when the show came to Australia and to Sydney. But you know, we Americans have handled everything so badly that we're now international pariahs. So we're not allowed in anybody else's country unless in Australia we can come if we stay in a hotel room, a guarded hotel room, for two
well,
weeks.
well,
And unfortunately, I didn't have 2 weeks that I could just be in a hotel room, even though it sounded quite nice. So I couldn't get there for it.
and I'm not sure if you know the history of how Australia's dealt with the pandemic, but Victoria had a considerable outbreak. So we were the cretins of Australia for a while. So we were locked in. Everybody else was. So I know how you feel. And actually, on a serious note, because you know, I do hope and send great love to you and all of the people around you in this really tricky time. I know that it's been hard for everyone this year, and I've been looking at. I mean, as I was saying to Stephen earlier, everybody, you could sit down and do a week of Stephen Schwartz interviews. There's so many interviews on YouTube. There's so many amazing opportunities you've had to talk about writing. And I was thinking, what do we bring to this conversation? And part of what I wanted to bring was just what's happening now, and just to find out how you've spent this year. Like, what happens when you're a Broadway writer and there's no Broadway? What do you do?
Well, it's been a pretty tough year, to be honest. I had imagined when the pandemic first happened and the shutdown hit in March of the year, you know, and everybody, you know, first had the initial shock. Suddenly, I had a Broadway show that wasn't there, 2 shows in London's West End that weren't there, and several other productions of Wicked, etc., around the world gone. So first there was the shock, but then I thought, well, I'll have all this time that I didn't expect to have. So surely I will spend this doing a lot of writing. But I found I couldn't do that. It was really psychologically challenging for me. I do have a couple of friends who have gleefully recounted to me how much writing they've gotten done. But I was not among them. It's only been in the last couple of months that I've sort of found the wherewithal to begin doing some writing for long-term projects again. That's not to say I couldn't do sort of one-off assignments. If somebody needed a song, one song for one particular thing, and there was a deadline, I found I was able to do that. But I've spent my life doing sort of long-term projects. You know, a show takes several years from the time you begin on it to the time it's actually in rehearsal and getting ready for a performance. And I'm accustomed to thinking in those sort of long-term ways, and I just couldn't do it for about the first 6 months of the pandemic.
Yeah, I have a feeling people had really different response. Certainly here in Australia, there was the kind of initial scramble to maintain being seen, you know, in a new technology or whatever that was going to be. And then just forgiving yourself for just actually taking some time, because there's a lot going on in the world that, you know, people have had to navigate in a new way. And I mean, you once said to me, all we need as a writer, all I need is a good idea and a deadline. I'll never forget when you said that. I was like, wow, it's simpler. I go, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say you can write kind of smaller projects, one-off songs, those sorts of things. I'm very interested in talking about how you write a score. And you said that sometimes it can take years. What is the longest what is the longest gestation period for a show that you've been involved with?
Well, it depends how you define that. I've had shows which were initially not successful and not fully realized in their first productions. You mentioned the Baker's Wife, for instance, which was destined for Broadway or planned for Broadway back in the 70s, closed out of town. We just never got the show right. Many years later, I was approached by the wonderful director Trevor Nunn from London, who had heard songs from it and wanted to do a production. And so a production was done in the West End and did pretty well, but still didn't feel entirely as if we'd solved the show. And then subsequently to that, there were a few regional productions in the States, and ultimately one at a well-known regional theater in America called the Paper Mill Playhouse, where we finally felt like, all right, we have this show. So that gestation period was about 30 years. But I think what you're really asking is, a show like Wicked or a show like Prince of Egypt, to name the two shows of mine that are currently running or will be currently running when they come back after the restrictions are lifted. And each of those, from sort of deciding we're going to make a stage show out of it to first performance, performance like on Broadway or on the West End, that's about 5 years. That's about a 5-year period.
So that must be,
that's typical.
I have, even in what you just said, Stephen, I've got a bunch of questions about, that must be arduous then. It's you want to know it's a good idea. You want to know that you're heading down something that you go, I could devote the next 5 years of my life to this.
That's correct.
What do you do when you go down a path and you realize 2 years in that it's not a good idea? Or does that ever happen? Do you ever sort of go down the wrong path that doesn't lead to fruition?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've had that experience maybe 3 or 4 times. And for me, it's less, this isn't a good idea, because I think if it were genuinely not a good idea, I wouldn't have begun it. But it's the discovery that it's not a good idea for me, that I can't find my way into the characters or really connect with the story or hear what this really should sound like. And this is something that one discovers. It's not as if you start right out and everything about the show you're working on. You're discovering it as you go along. But usually, I find like I can connect with the major characters. I can get inside their psyches. I have a sense of what the overall sound of the show should be, and then it's problem solving. But every now and then and usually it's because there's a collaborator that I'm excited about working with. And so I think, well, I don't quite see this for me yet, but this is such a great writer or such a terrific director. I really want the chance to work with this person. So I'm going to start down there and maybe I'll find my way into it. And sometimes I have, but there have been occasions where I just finally have to say, you know what, it's not for me. And that doesn't mean it's not for somebody else. It's just, I can't find my way into it.
And I guess on the flip side, you probably have some projects that you just automatically go, this sits somewhere. There's something about this one that that kind of does propel itself from the first moment. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Stephen, when you talked about collaborators, and because music theatre, it's the great art form is the collaboration. But I noticed that, it's not like, Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice in the early days where they were just a consistent team, or Kander and Ebb, or you have worked with so many different people on so many projects. Is that deliberate? Do you seek out, what do you look for in a collaborator? I'm very interested in that.
It is deliberate because I feel I learn so much from each collaborator and each new group of people, and so I guess I have sought that out. I do have some, you know, consistent collaborators. Alan Menken, of course. I've done 3 different movies with, and a stage adaptation of one of them, and we are now talking about the possibility of another movie that we're going to do together. So, that's pretty consistent for me. But other than that, you're correct. It's always been a different book writer for the most part. Occasionally working with another composer, another lyricist, different directors frequently. And again, I just feel, yeah, I'm looking to learn and grow from each project that I do. And obviously, these very talented people that I've had the opportunity to work with, each of them brings something to this. And then I can learn from that. And I guess, I look for obviously somebody whose work I respond to. I not only admire, but feel an emotional connection to their work. And then a lot of it just has to do with how we respond to one another as people,
Yeah.
when we start talking.
Of course. I mean, it's the magic. It's the kind of alchemy of collaboration, isn't it? It's which is what's interesting, because you have, you know, there's been a lot of people write a lot of musicals, but you've done the thing of capturing magic in a bottle on those really, Wicked is a thing that is just in its own, one of those ones that it's in its own category. Godspell, Pippin, Prince of Egypt, when it it eventually comes back and the world sees it. And it's interesting that I imagine there'd be a temptation to repeat a formula and go, well, this worked. Let's get the gang back together again, and let's do the next thing. And it's really interesting to me to hear how you keep challenging yourself, and it's really the interest in storytelling and learning and evolving that moves us all along, I guess, and intrigues us about this art form.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just responding to a story or a character or a group of characters that feels like territory that I understand and that I have an emotional connection to,
Mm.
and then with my collaborators, we try to tell that story as well as we possibly can, and but you can never know when something's going to turn out to be Wicked, or Godspell, where the timing is so right, and that you just hit the zeitgeist at a particular moment, and it becomes more than just a successful show, that somehow it comes to stand for an era, or what's happening in the moment. But that's not something, and as you say, I've been very lucky to have that happen to me a couple of times in my life. But that's certainly not something you can plan on or predict or even aim for. You just try and tell your story as well as you possibly can, and tell a story that matters to you, and then hope that it will matter to some other people as well.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful. Can I ask, Stephen, then, can I take that moment to sort of ask where it began? And I know there's a bit of stuff that anyone can sort of read up about this, about in terms of your early influences and growing up and your parents' influences with music. But I just wonder, a while back I sent you a recording of something that I'd put together, and the composer of that said to me, he'd once said to me that when he was learning piano, this is Christopher Harley for people in Australia who might know him. When he was learning piano, he turned around to his piano teacher and said, I don't want to do that. I want to do something that you've written. And the piano teacher went, oh, no, I just teach the piano. I don't write. And he was, 5 or something. And he just thought, well, that's just weird. Oh, that's weird. Like, why aren't we doing the things that you want to do? And so he just went, let's do something that I do. And inherently he knew he was a composer from a very young, he sort of just went, if I'm playing the piano, I'm making the music. Do you remember like the first song you wrote, or were you always tinkling on the piano?
Well, once I started um, taking piano lessons, once my parents got a piano for me, then yes, the truth is I was. Um, musical ability is inherited. It's genetic. It's not something we can take a lot of credit for any more than we can for the color of our eyes. And it is a genetic trait that presents early, which is why there are so many musical prodigies. Everyone's always stunned that a 7-year-old played this on the violin, or a 9-year-old wrote this. But that's not all that uncommon with music, just because of how early the gift, if you receive it, presents itself. So I was always a very musical kid. And there's my phone that I forgot to take out of my room. Sorry. Usually I remember to take the phone out of the room when I'm going to do one of those. So everybody just ignore that. It will stop very soon. So yeah, what happened for me was my parents, who are not musical or in show business in any way at all, happened to live next door when I was growing up to a composer whose name was George Kleinsinger. And he had written what we would now call concept albums, a couple of successful concept albums. And one of them was being turned into a Broadway show. And I was about 7 years old. And my parents would often go next door, and George would play whatever the newest song he was working on for the show would be. And I'm told, although I don't have obviously memory of this, that when they would then adjourn, I would go over to his piano and pick out the tune and kind of sing it to myself. And so he recognized that I had an ear for music, and he suggested to my parents that they might want to get me a piano and piano lessons. And that's how that began. So when I started playing, even though I was, doing the teaching little fingers to play and the typical, easier classical pieces that one learns, I always came to it with the idea that basically one wrote songs. And in fact, my mother reminds me that, sometimes she would be, in the kitchen, and I would be in the living room where our piano was, purportedly practicing. And then at a certain point, I would be playing something, and she would call from the kitchen, "That doesn't sound like Mr. Beethoven to me." Then I would have to go back and play the pieces that I was supposed to be playing.
Was there, I mean, with that little quip, was there any kind of background hope that you would go into classical music? Is that what I mean? Let's bear in mind that you have written opera, but what I mean is, like, did you know that you were going to? You're also, I hear in your beautiful kind of solo work, it's folk infused. There's so many. I mean,
well, my parents, again, were not musicians, but they were concert goers. And they particularly liked folk music and what we would now call world music. They had a lot of recordings like that. And so I listened to a lot of that growing up. I did also study guitar, and both classical and folk guitar. But yeah, I never had any aspirations to be a classical performer, although when I was younger, I did write, a sonata this and a fantasia that, because that's what you're studying, and maybe I would have gone in that direction, but because I started out right away with a next door neighbor who was working on a show, and a couple of years later, I went to see that show and was just had that experience that so many people who wind up in the theater do, of being instantly smitten and feeling that this was where I wanted to spend my life. If I could just spend my life in this atmosphere of musical theater, that's where I wanted to be. So I really never had much question as to what direction I was going to go in. Most of my generation who became songwriters became pop songwriters. And a lot of them were singer-songwriters, I'm a little bit younger than Paul Simon and Joni Mitchell, and I'm pretty much the same age as James Taylor. I think a little younger than Elton. But all those people became pop writers. But I went towards musical theater.
But it is interesting because you did go towards musical theatre, but you brought a whole pop world into musical theatre that we take for granted now. We sort of go, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, but when you look at the evolution of musical theatre and you look at Rodgers and Hammerstein and you look at what was there, and then, suddenly we have Godspell, we have Pippin, I mean, obviously there was the rock musicals like Hair, but that was a particular statement about rock music, whereas you were telling stories through pop music in a way that now is just a matter of course. But was that unusual at the time?
It was, and there was resistance to it from some members of the critical community and from some, sort of members of the musical theater establishment. You've put your finger on it. The idea was you could do a show like Hair, which was basically a review about hippies, and have pop music. But if you were really going to have characters and tell a story, then you had to use traditional theater music. And that wasn't the music that I was listening to. It wasn't the music that I felt in my heart and my soul. So I didn't want to write that music. So what I think I basically did, and there were a few of us. I mean, you mentioned Andrew Lloyd Webber, and he's one who also, he's a contemporary of mine, and he was basically doing the same thing, which was using traditional musical theater storytelling but then doing it, and lyrics that were basically musical theater lyrics, but then having a pop music sound. But when I started doing it in America, and Andrew did, there were very few of us. Alan Menken a little bit later. But for a while, we were sort of the outsiders, and musical theater was, in terms of music, was continuing down a more traditional path, a wonderful path with writers like Stephen Sondheim, and you talked about Kander and Ebb, etc. But gradually now, basically, musical theater music and pop music are pretty much identical.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who would have thought back then you'd have something like Hamilton?
Hamilton and Six, and shows like that. But Dear Evan Hansen, etc. But what we were doing at first was anomalous, and we did encounter some resistance.
And can I ask? I want to go. Look, to be honest, I have like 30 years of questions that I've got to fit into the next 33 minutes. So, and then I'm also going to open up to people who are watching as well to questions. Please put in any questions now, and I'll just bring them in as we talk. Otherwise, I will use all of the 32 minutes and more. Stephen, I do want to talk about kind of the early years. I know it's been documented, but you worked with very quick. I mean, I just go, what was it like to be in your early 20s and be working with Leonard Bernstein? I mean, that is like, that's, hanging out with the Pope, surely. How do you even start to engage as a collaborator when you have that respect? What was that experience like? What was that relationship like?
It was complicated. I was intimidated in some ways. In other ways, I had the arrogance of youth, and the way I wound up working with Leonard Bernstein was that my agent was Shirley Bernstein, who was Lenny's sister, and she happened to know that her brother had a very fast approaching deadline to write a mass, which he had promised for the opening of the Kennedy Center. And that opening was about 3 months away. And they had announced it, and they had been selling tickets to it. And he didn't have anything. He had a bunch of little shards of music and a couple of ideas here and there, but he really didn't have any kind of coherent piece. And he had tried with a couple of other collaborators, and that hadn't worked out. And finally, Shirley brought him to see Godspell, and she said, you know, I have this client. He's 23-year-old kid, but you know, he's good with musical theater structure. Maybe he can help you with this. And so that's how that came about. And yes, I was quite intimidated. I can't say that I think I did my best work of all time on it. I learned a lot as I went along, and I feel if I were doing it now, I would probably do it a bit better. And I learned so much from him. Lenny was probably as close to a mentor as anyone I ever had. I learned a great deal, obviously, about music and about language, and also just how to be in the world and how to be if you were an artist. You know, I learned there were positive lessons and things that I observed that I thought, oh, well, that's something to try to avoid if I can. But that was an enormously valuable experience,
What, what
but
an
intimidating.
Yeah. Oh, I can imagine. And an extraordinary thing, you know, with the success of Godspell being kind of, I imagine, largely surprising, to suddenly be with Leonard Bernstein doing a mass at the Kennedy Center. I mean, that's just, and 23 years old. It's kind
Yeah,
of,
3 months later, it was,
it,
you know, well, I actually started working with Lenny about a month after Godspell opened, and 3 months later was the premiere of Mass at the Kennedy Center. You know, with the with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis coming to the opening, and you know, opening night party with Alan J. Lerner and Avril Harriman, and it was crazy. Yeah.
I mean, it must have I mean, that must have been quite a kind of entree into the world that you're on your way. I did want to ask something that you said when you said, look, you know, obviously, you know, you look back and you may look at it now and with all that you have learned, go, oh, I would do something different. Do you ever get tempted to go back and revise and revisit and reshape? I don't mean in the way that, for instance, Baker's Wife, which you spoke about, potentially never quite met its potential, you know, at the time, and so then that's quite a review of the work over time. But do you look back at things you wrote earlier on and just go, well, that's who I was, and leave it, or do you want to get in there and just kind of fix a few things?
No, I do it all the time. I fix things all the time, including Mass, which you know, which we were just talking about, and then sort of had a resurgence a couple of years ago, and suddenly there were productions happening. And I remember I went to a forum. I was asked to participate in a forum at a place where they were doing a production of Mass, and we were talking about the piece, and I was saying some things about, you know, things of the lyrics that I thought I could have done better, and then suddenly I thought, oh wait, I'm actually not dead. I actually could fix this, and so I did do some work on it again, and you know, I did it with the assistance and blessing of Jamie Bernstein, Lenny's daughter, who was the is the artistic executor of his estate. Yeah, but I do that all the time. You know, when Pippin, we were just talking about, which has just opened in Sydney, and when we were doing the production for 2013, you know, I fixed some stuff, changed some words, and fixed some things that I thought could be better.
And look, just on that, in terms of revivals, because you know, I expect what also happens is that, you know, everything has its season, everything has its time. When you create a Wicked, people go, let's get Pippin back, let's get Gospel back, let's kind of look at the catalogue that was there as well and kind of revise. When you go into a revival like Pippin with, as you say, Diane Paulus, such an amazing director who has such a different take than the Bob Fosse original, although still, you know, paying homage through the physical language of the piece. Do you just sort of stand back and let it happen, or are you involved in those new sort of big Broadway revivals?
No, if it's a major first class revival that's going to be on Broadway, or let's say in the West End, then absolutely I'm involved with it. You know, I worked closely with Diane, for whom I have the greatest both respect and affection. And when Godspell was revived on Broadway in 2011, and Danny Goldstein did a kind of new production, and we were rethinking the orchestrations, etc. Again, worked very closely with him. Yeah, that's part of the fun. I mean, obviously, every time a production of mine is done, I can't and wouldn't want to be there tinkering around. But if it's really going to be a major production and a really fresh look is going to be taken at the show, then I want to be involved with it.
Are you ever, let's take Pippin, for instance, and I think it's kind of well documented that the original production was a tricky time for you personally with Bob Fosse and that process and his sort of, take on being kind of the master of the rehearsal room and what all that looked like. Do you, when you go and revisit the material again, is it in any way, are the ghosts of it hard to go back to? You kind of you put that to bed. That's what that was, and then you come back to it all these years later. Is it like, what is the process of revisiting the thing from all those years earlier?
Well, I've learned a lot about Pippin over the years, and to be honest, I've come to appreciate a great deal Bob's point of view, Bob Fosse's point of view about it. As we've said, I was very, very young when it opened on Broadway. I was 24 years old, and I had a certain point of view about the character of Pippin and the story we were telling, and Bob was coming from an older and more cynical point of view, and so there was a good deal of clash between us. But over the years, I've really come to appreciate what he was doing and what the tone that he was bringing to the show was. And now I've embraced it so much that I sometimes laughingly say that I've become the guardian of Bob's vision, and that somewhere he's looking up and laughing.
I love it. And look, for those people in Australia, you can see Pippin. It's on at the Lyric Theatre at the moment in Sydney, and you can get tickets through Ticketmaster. And hopefully it will end up coming around the country because it's a spectacular production. I haven't seen the Sydney production, but I saw this production on Broadway twice. And so I look forward to seeing it next week, actually, when we can go back to a theatre. Yeah. So
I was so hoping to get there for the production, but I couldn't quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel. So, well, I said that already.
Yeah, fair enough.
You'll have to go in my behest.
I intend to, and I look forward to it. I've got things I need to ask you, but I also want to make sure that the people who are sending all these questions in I'll pepper these. And Stephen, we've got some extraordinary, beautiful, not only friends, but it's lovely to see Josh Pitterman. Last time I saw Josh was at the start of this year. He was playing the Phantom on the West End. Last time I saw, little did we know a month later, what was going to happen. And Alinta Chidsey, who has just at the start of this year was Velma Kelly in Chicago, played all the amazing roles. She has a question here for you, which I'm going to jump to straight away. Alinta, who was our first guest on Sunday Soiree, has said, great interview, Ty and Stephen. Thanks, Alinta. What techniques do you use if you face a block with writing, Stephen?
I'm so glad to answer this question, Alinta, and I actually have an answer for you. Because at one time, I was experiencing writer's block. It was when I was working on Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Disney animated feature, and I just was not able to move forward with songs, and it was like the movie cliche of scribbling something down and then crumpling up the paper and throwing it on the floor, and exactly that. And then I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a wonderful songwriter who is known in Australia, John Bacchino, who's done a lot of work in Australia, and David Campbell sings a lot of his songs, etc. So maybe some of your audience will know John. He's a great writer and a great friend of mine. And I was telling him about this and kind of complaining about the fact that I was experiencing this block. And John said, "Oh, well, you're being the editor too early. That's all. You're trying to be the editor too soon," which is the most useful piece of advice, or one of the most useful things anyone has ever said to me. Because what I realized, of course, is that when we are writing, we're actually wearing two hats or switching hats back and forth. We are the writer who's just generating raw material, and then we are the editor who's looking at that material and making choices and judging it and saying like, oh, well, I'm going to keep this, but that's not very good. I'm going to get rid of it. Well, if you let the editor get there too soon, then all you're going to have is criticism, and you're going to experience writer's block. So what you have to do is shut the editor up and allow yourself to do bad work, but just do work. Just get it out there. And then you can come back and bring the editor in. And once I realized that, then, I was able to give myself permission to do, not very good work at first, but to get something there, and ultimately was able to, bring it forth to my satisfaction. And since that time, I've never had a struggle with writer's block again. So that is the solution to writer's block: is shut up the editor, no judgment for a while, just write, and don't worry about if it's good or bad.
Beautiful. I know, Stephen, in my writing class, we do like 5-minute writing projects, and you just have to keep your pen going. And when everybody gets up and goes, "Oh, I was going down this path. I'm sorry. It didn't quite work out." And actually, the teacher has only allowed us to say one word, and for whatever reason, it's just apples. So or you can say, that's your excuse. You just go apples and then read it. And actually, sometimes it's better than you thought anyway. Just getting it out, getting the thing out. I wanted to say before I go another question as well. John Bacchino is hosting his, was it 30th anniversary of Grateful this Tuesday night as well?
It's some anniversary. Yes, yeah. I'm making an appearance. I'm singing a song on it.
So that's great. If anybody have a check that out. John Bacchino's beautiful album Grateful. There's a beautiful online concert next Tuesday. I'm going to go to Jonathan Holmes. Jonathan Holmes, been a long time since I've seen you. Hello, my friend. A wonderful composer in Sydney, Stephen. And he says, when you collaborate with a lyricist or composer, how do you wrestle with the creative disagreements that come up when you're obviously capable of doing both? Jonathan, you stole my question. When do you take a back seat, and when do you fight for something?
That's another really great question. A collaboration is basically like a marriage. And I know that's a cliche to say, but ultimately, I think both partners need to be happy. And so, if I'm working on something and my collaborator and I have a disagreement, we try to find another way. That's something that we both can embrace. There's always another solution. And so, if you look for another solution, you may come up with something that ultimately is better than what you were wanting to fight for in the first place. And as a matter of fact, generally you will, because if your writing partner is not happy with what you're doing, there's likely to be something wrong with it. If you have a writing partner with whom you share an aesthetic. I'll give you, one sort of funny example, which is a story on myself, which is in my collaboration with Alan Menken, the first song we wrote together was Colors of the Wind for Pocahontas. And it was very happily received by Disney, and we were getting ready to go into the studio and record it with a big orchestra, and Judy Kuhn was coming in to sing, and it was going to cost a lot of money. And about a week before the session happened, I got this call from Alan. And at this point, we hadn't been working together very long, so we hadn't really worked out our shorthand. And he said to me, "Listen, I don't know how to tell you this, but the last lyric for the song, I just don't like it. And I haven't been saying anything, but I just felt like I had to say something now." And, of course, I argued with him, and it was a tricky triple rhyme. And I told him why it was going to be so difficult to find something else. And but then ultimately he was my collaborator, so I said, all right, well, I will change it. So here's what the original last lyric of Colors of the Wind was, which I tell you with some embarrassment because I realize now it's not very good. But the last three lines of Colors of the Wind originally were, "For your life's an empty hull till you get it through your skull. You can paint with all the colors of the wind." And Alan was like, "I just don't think the word skull belongs in this song." And so then I struggled to try and find a triple rhyme, and I couldn't do it, and that was any good. And I finally just abandoned it. And so what the final three lines are, which is infinitely better, is you can own the earth and still all you'll own is earth until you can paint with all the colors of the wind. So much better. If my collaborator had not told me that he hated the thing that I had written, I probably never would have come up with that.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's such a great answer, Stephen, because I've been wondering as well, because you write music and because you can write music and lyrics, when you write lyrics, are you imagining a melody in your own head and then you get something else? Like, I just wonder where you put that part of your brain when you
Sure. Well, what you imagine a rhythm or whatever. Now, with Alan, we tend to work music first, so that problem does not present itself. But I alluded to my work on Mass, and there were a couple, the Bernstein Mass, and there were a couple of instances where I handed Lenny an entire lyric, which he then set. And of course, I had a whole rhythm and music in my head. And then it came out very differently. What I didn't know to do then, but what I would do now, is then take the music that Lenny had written and have that be, all right, if this is the music, then what words go with this? And kind of throw out what I had before, or at least a lot of it, and write to that music. Didn't know enough to do it then, but as I say, now I would know to do that.
Awesome. Okay, we've got one from Joel King. He wants to talk about Prince of Egypt, which I'm thrilled about.
Happy to talk about.
Look, and Joel says he sort of grew up on Prince of Egypt. I grew up wanting Prince of Egypt to be a Broadway musical. When it finally happened, I was insanely happy. It's my absolute favorite musical. How did you feel returning to that story and writing so many new pieces to match and enhance what you'd already written 20 years ago? Joel, you took my question. And did you worry about pleasing those who are major fans of the animated film?
Well, of course, we didn't want to disappoint the many fans of the film, but we didn't really think that we would, because it was myself doing the score again, Philip Lazebnik, who was the major screenwriter, the main screenwriter for the movie, doing the book for the musical. But what was really enjoyable was to be able to go back and have the time, because obviously a show is longer than an animated feature, really to go into some more of the characters in depth and investigate more nuances in the relationships. There's a whole new character and relationship in the show that doesn't exist in the movie at all. And we retained 5 of the 6 songs from the movie. One just seemed tonally wrong, and the character had changed. But then, to be able to go back to that musical world, I had a fantastic orchestrator, August Eriksson, who is great with the instruments of a culture and a place. And he found all these great Middle Eastern instruments that I was able to write for, and he was able to orchestrate for. So it became really exciting to revisit it. And, I think the story is just enhanced, as I say, and deepened. And thus far, we were only able to play a couple of weeks, before the pandemic shut us down, but we were getting really wonderful response from the audience, and people who were fans of the movie really embraced the show. So yeah, it felt really good.
I can tell everyone out there that it is quite an experience. I was lucky enough to be in London and to be during techs and watching the show put together. And it's a big show. It's a big show. And it's a big, it's an epic story. You sort of go, how do you put that on stage? But you've put epic stories on stage before, and this does not disappoint. And good director. Where did you meet that director? He's quite
yeah. It's a director that I'd stumbled across before. No, my son Scott Schwartz, who's one of my favorite directors, and is very good with these sort of big theatrical, high concept kind of shows. Did it and just did an amazing job. And the cast album, even though the show's not running right now, the London cast album is out, and I'm very happy with it. So people who are interested, can hear that.
Yeah, it was a great relief actually. That was a little solace of mine in lockdown. It was like I could go to that cast album, which managed, happily was done prior to opening, so you could mix it and get it all out. Thankfully, we are going to talk a little more about that, Joel. Coming up, because the song that we've got coming up is from Prince of Egypt. But I thought I would just go to Morgan Garrity now and find out, what's your favorite source for inspiration? Is there one source, Stephen, or is it many?
No, I would say it's many. I listen to different music all the time, things that people have heard, a writer that someone's heard, or a singer that someone's heard, and of course, like everybody else, I'm seeing what's out there, and some things speak to me more than others. So yeah, I think there's just kind of constant inspiration out there in the work that other people are doing, or my discovery of work that's been around that I haven't known. Each project requires entering its world and doing whatever research is necessary for that, and taking inspiration from that. I have this sort of glib joke that I make: in lieu of inspiration, do research. So sometimes I do draw a lot of ideas that I have from research that I'm doing about a specific project.
And that was on one of my, in another conversation, I want to talk to you about research and the value of that, but that's part two down the path, because there's more questions. And also I find, Stephen, like in our conversations over the years, we don't just talk theatre, we talk all sorts of things that are the kind of, I think sometimes when you're thinking about music theatre, you have to look, my experience is looking outside of music theatre for inspiration, looking at life and looking at what this year has meant, and what does that mean? And I think sometimes we can get a bit narrow in the theatre about trying to find inspiration in what we see in the theatre rather than what we see in life and how we emulate that.
And other media, other forms of art are very inspiring. How other artists who are working, in a different artistic language approach a subject can really trigger something.
Awesome. I completely agree. There's a question here from George Abbott. Great name.
Oh, a director that I've always admired. It's great to meet him.
And here he is showing up today. George has said, "Hi, Stephen. You mentioned writing to deadlines before, but what other methods have you found useful to maintain motivation during lockdown?" Did you maintain motivation, or did you give yourself a...
No, I'm sorry to tell you, George, I found none. Deadlines were the only things that helped me, but that's me, and probably my own psychic frailty, because as I say, I have friends who said to me, well, I'm sure you're using this time to just write, because that's what I've been doing. I've written 4 musicals, or I've turned out 3 screenplays, and more power to them. I couldn't find the motivation to write during the lockdown.
What do you do when you're not writing, Stephen? What is the rest of your world like? What do you like that's not writing?
Well, after I got over being depressed about, during this whole experience, I thought, well, if I'm not going to be writing, I should at least be doing other things. So I've been working on my French, and I'm going to start on Spanish again. I decided that I'm going to try and, get two languages which I know a little bit and be better at them. And I've actually been practicing the piano and just playing old classical pieces and, other things that, I haven't picked up in decades. And that's been fun too. So just doing some other pursuits and other challenges that are different from writing.
I think it's important. I think it's important that we're always allowed to be off the hook from not having to pursue the next thing and just have some time to, take the time that it takes. There's a question here from Jess Newman Stephen, I find your lyrics so deeply philosophical and brimming with ideas. I think of Through Heaven's Eyes. When planning a song, do you plan certain themes or ideas you want to convey? And what techniques do you use to condense such rich ideas into a line or two? Another good question.
Yeah, thank you, Jess, and thank you for mentioning Through Heaven's Eyes. Of course, it's a song from Prince of Egypt, and it's one of my personal favorites. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the process of songwriting, which is to arrive at what is the song really about? What is the character trying to do? What is the character trying to say? What are the ideas that the character is trying to get across to someone else or to him or herself, etc. And then it's exactly what you said. It is really a process of compression and condensation, not condensation, that water condensation, but getting it condensed. I read Stephen Sondheim's 2 books about the writing of lyrics, and that is precisely what he talks about, the art of compression in creating a lyric. But I find that you start with a lot. You try to get a lot of raw material, just get the ideas kind of out there on the page. Again, don't be the editor too soon. Don't try to compress too soon. Make sure you really know what is it you're saying, and and how would the character express this, and then you begin to hone it down.
What's fantastic, Stephen, is hearing you talk. It really is as a storyteller. It comes through music, it comes through lyrics, but it's about the story and that moment. When my experience as an actor was always, I love acting and singing. It was great. I always had a sense of sort of what I would do and how it would go. I could almost write the reviews, and that was all good. When I'm a director, I find out what I don't know. So I know the idea of what I'm after, and then I find out, like I draw on, there's a certain amount of it that is a little bit hard to define, as technical as it can be. There's the technical side of it, and then there's the kind of the inspiration part of it where you find out what that character wants to say. And I imagine there's probably a balance of both of those things for you, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's discovery, and sometimes it's surprise. As a writer, you're not really in control of what you do a lot of the time. People sometimes will mention a particular line of a song or a particular rhyme that I've written, and I'll say, like, yes, that was so lucky. I remember when I stumbled across that was such a piece of luck to find that nugget just kind of lying there in my path. But it feels like that. It doesn't feel as if, I put it into life, but more that it was there and I discovered it. It's such a fascinating process because a lot of it is conscious, but so much of it is unconscious and unexpected and surprising. But that's what makes it so much. It can be very frustrating, but it's also what makes it so exciting and so exhilarating.
Absolutely. Stephen, I'm going to have one more question because I find it fascinating that we haven't kind of spent the whole time talking about Wicked, and it might be somewhat of a relief because I imagine you've talked about it so much.
I have talked about it a lot. So
there was a question from Denise.
I'm happy to talk about it.
Which was just, what was the first song you wrote for Wicked? Where did that, remember?
Okay. Well, it is very unusual for me in writing a show to write the first song of the show first. I almost never do that. Basically, my process that I've developed has been with my collaborators to work out the structure of the show, the storyboard, if you will, or the outline, and then sort of identify certain moments in that story that are probably best told through music, and then picking the one that seems the path of least resistance to me and saying like, all right, I'm going to start with that. That's the one I know. For instance, we mentioned Colors of the Wind. That was the first song that Alan and I wrote for Pocahontas, but it's certainly not the first song in the movie. However, for Wicked, the first song that I wrote was a version of the opening, which is No One Mourns the Wicked. I knew that I wanted the show to open with the equivalent of Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, the celebration of the death of the Wicked Witch of the West, and all of Oz with great joy and relief celebrating that she was finally gone, and then flashback and come back to that moment towards the end of the show. And of course, the audience has a much different point of view of it at that moment. But yeah, so the very first song for Wicked was a version of No One Mourns the Wicked, although the structure of the song changed a lot over time. Glinda was not as significantly featured in it originally. That was a discovery we made during the writing process.
Mm. And there are lots of wonderful chats that, you've been so articulate about. I think, once upon a time, we wondered how Broadway musicals were put together, and now we kind of are much more, maybe it's the internet, but we're much more involved in, the stories about Wicked and the stories about, where you got to with The Wizard and I and Making Good, and that shift of finding the right song for the right moment. And I could talk about, all of this all day. I mean, and Stephen and I often do.
We do.
And your beautiful way of taking existing stories and finding a way of looking at them again, which you've done quite a lot over your career. And that probably might lead us to having a song, because I want to hear a song and then come back and then say goodbye.
Okay.
So every week on these Sunday soirees, somebody sings a little something for us. And if you're going to interview one of the world's best composers, you go, well, who's going to sing the song? But I don't know if everybody knows that you're a singer. In fact, you've got 2 albums out that are just my favorite.
Thank you.
They're so wonderful, and they belong to the kind of, for me, they're very personal, stories about your life in a kind of folk type genre, and they're just beautiful. And I always think it's wonderful when you can hear a composer sing the thing they created. And this, I guess, goes back to that wonderful question we had earlier about when you came back to Prince of Egypt and were filling it out and had more time. I just wonder, Stephen, if you would set up this song for us and why you thought it was important for this song to be put in, given that it wasn't in the movie.
Yeah, well, obviously the protagonist, this is the I Want song, if you will, for the character of Moses. And he's a tricky character to write an I Want song for, turns out, because he, at the beginning of the story, he doesn't know who he actually is. He's living this life of a prince of Egypt, with very little responsibility and a lot of pleasure, and he's kind of, a playboy. He doesn't even have the pressure that his brother has of knowing he's going to be Pharaoh one day. He's just basically hanging out at the palace and having a good time. But it is his nature, it's in his character, that somehow, enjoyable as this seems, it's really not quite enough for him. And so what I tried to do with the first song that Moses sings in the show is to express that kind of ineffable kind of dissatisfaction. There's something, but he doesn't quite know what it is that he wants, that he can't even define yet what it is he wants, because it's something he learns as the show goes along. So it was a little bit of a tricky one to write. But this is the one that that ultimately I came up with. It's called Footprints on the Sand, and yeah, it happens very early in the show, while he still thinks that his life is going to be that of this Prince of Egypt in a palace for his whole life.
Beautiful. Let's have a listen.
I could ride one of the horses, go and shoot some arrows, take a sail on the royal bark. But standing in the shadow of these statues of the pharaohs, I see the contrast couldn't be more stark. Their deeds forever known, in story, song, and stone, while I won't leave the faintest mark. Like the humblest of slaves, I won't leave the faintest mark. Footprints on the sand, ripples on the river, whiskey drifting clouds that blow across the desert sky. One day we are here, and the next we vanish in the blink of an ibis eye. We vanish in the blink of an ibis eye. It's not that I want glory or the world to know my name, but maybe just to leave things a little change from when I came. But it's not my lot, use what you've got, and all I am is footprints on the sand, ripples on the river, echoes of the sound from a distant fading chime. One day we are here, and the next we vanish, but I'm a fool, and so I like to fool myself that I'm not just footprints on the sand, but someone who leaves footprints on the sands of time.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's
Thank
such a
you.
to hear that song and to hear you sing it, and it's such a great song, and it captures.
It's better when Luke sings it, I have to say. He sings a bit better than I do.
There's such it's just a different thing. I mean, you listen to it in the cast recording, and it's this incredible lush thing of this young man doing it, but it's also something really, to hear a composer sing their own work, I find it really, really moving, and to hear also some ideas that come across in some of your other work as well about what it is to leave something behind and to be changed for good. And the music theatre community has been changed because of what you do, and not only what you write, but who you are, who you've been to me personally. And I am one of, my story is not unique. I have walked through Broadway with you, walked down the streets as people have come out of theatres and gone, Stephen, and you sort of it feels like I'm walking with the mayor of New York. Your generosity is so amazing and wonderful, and quite aside from your remarkable talent. Tell me, you've been to Tasmania, haven't you? You went there.
I have. I loved it there. Yeah. And I meant to get out, and I forgot to get out. I got a little Tasmanian devil stuffed animal that's actually sitting on my shelf over there, but I forgot to bring it, so it was here. Yeah, I went to the one of the nature parks there to see the Tasmanian devil. So, how are they doing with the cancer? Have they managed to solve that? There were a lot of them falling by the wayside.
Actually, I haven't heard about that for a while, but you know, I suspect there's probably still work to be done there.
Yeah, that was very upsetting. But yeah, you know, got to go to the, you know, the nature park, and the vineyards were, it was the wrong time of year for the vineyards, so they just weren't quite open yet. But we still had a very, very nice meal at one
Well,
of them, and I forget the name of the big, the big mountain that's in Hobart, but yeah, but went up to the top of that. Yeah, I loved it there. It was great.
well, it is a truly like beautiful, beautiful place, and we're so excited about the Australian Musical Theatre Festival. I mean, the last time there was a festival, and it was a beautiful festival that John X and Jane Forrest put together. It's absolutely beautiful. Two headliners who you know, because they starred in a little show of yours. Rob Mills and Gemma Ricks came down and did
Oh yeah.
It was just wonderful. Oh, we got a thing to say. Devils are improving. Great. That's from Belinda. So that's good. Thank you, Belinda. She keeps me up to date with everything. Good news this week. Oh, you've set the internet alight. So we've got good news about the Tasmanian Devils. I'll actually keep you posted on that.
Thank you so much. They're such wonderful creatures, and it was very upsetting that you know, there was this illness going through them. So I'm so happy to hear that they're finding, you know, help for that.
Well, I hope that one day we might get you down and you might be there for one of our festivals.
Oh, try to stop me once we're allowed out of our country again, because we're not being perceived, and rightly so, as such idiots. You know, once Americans are no longer international pariahs, as I've said. You know, I want to get there again.
Well, we can't wait to welcome you back to Australia. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you to everybody. And just a reminder that we will be announcing our program for the Australian Musical Theatre Festival, which will involve many great classes and performance events and conversations with composers, with directors. It'll be a chance for you to be in the room with casting directors. We're going to celebrate Tasmania. You know, it's the most, I mean, Stephen, you've been there, but as you say, maybe it wasn't the right time of year. May's really good. So everybody who's looking to get a holiday, come down to Launceston, and we're going to have a really wonderful experience down there. And I hope that for our industry, which has been, you know, it's had some really tricky times, like the whole world this year. Yeah. I'm hoping it's a place where we can come back and reconnect. And I do hope, Stephen, that at some point we can reconnect with you. Thank you for your amazing capacity. Sending you huge love over there. I can't wait to see you again on some continent when we're past this crazy time. Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great, safe holiday season, and we'll see you next year. Thanks.
Yeah, happy holidays, everybody. Happy Hanukkah, which it is, and Merry Christmas, etc. Yeah.
Bye. Thank you.